Hi, everybody. As promised, today we are going to talk about 3D Studio Max, and this is going to be a just kind of quick, really general overview, mostly aimed at artists. Um, when I use Max, I use it mostly for hard surface modeling. I've done a little bit of organic modeling in it. I've never used it for animation or anything like that, but part of the reason I love it is for its unwrapping tools, which we'll get to as part of this. This is the interface as you'll see it initially when it pops up. It'll automatically default to orthographic, the 4 split with your 3 orthographics in your perspective view. Um, the interface and the controls work a little bit different than they do in Maya. Everything in Max is run with the middle mouse button. So if you would like to move the camera around, you hold down the middle mouse button and move the mouse. If you want to rotate, you hold down the Alt button and hold down the middle mouse button, and then you can rotate. And then zooming is done just with the scroll wheel. If you'd like to focus on any given window, you can click in or hover over that window until it's highlighted, and then Alt W will focus that window, and Alt W will unfocus. So I can do this with any of them. Uh, Over here, we've got our, this is where we create all of our primitives at. It will generally default to standard primitives. This is what you're going to want to use most of the time. This is, if you're used to Maya, this is where you're going to find all of your most basic primitive geometry that you can start with. We also have a few other sections for creating NURBs and other surfaces. We've got lights and cameras, various helpers. I haven't really played with most of these. Space warps, and then some other systems that they have set up, like the daylight system that can be used with mental ray. I've used that a little bit. It's pretty cool. And under standard primitives, we actually have a lot more under here we can do. We can create extended primitives, and there's some cool stuff in here. This is a fast way to make things like uh, you can make a spindle quite quickly for all of your spindle making needs. Um, and this is actually kind of cool because sometimes you'll need to make some geometry kind of like these things. One thing to note though is these don't default to polygons when you create them. They're some weird proprietary geometry. So be aware of that when you're creating anything in here, and I'll show you how to actually deal with that in a minute. So let's say you've made this weird pill capsule thingy, and this is what you want to work with. First thing over here, any primitive you create until you lose focus on it, until you select something else or convert this to a different type of object, you'll be able to enter in a bunch of parameters over here. So if you're anal retentive like I am, or if you're building something very specific to a set scale, such as for Unity or Unreal, you can use these values to make sure that this is exactly the size that it needs to be. So for example, right now I'm working in centimeters. I've got all of my default units set to automatically go to centimeters, mostly for working in Unreal. I usually change these to meters when I'm working in Unity. But I can come in here and I like to even these out. So that's pretty close to 12. So we're going to make that 12 centimeters. The height's pretty close to 29. We're just going to round that up to 30. And the cap height will make 10. As you can see, it didn't really change anything here, but these values are just kind of easier to work with. And I can play with some of these values like blend, just to kind of blend the shape together a little bit more. Let's change that to like 2. I can adjust the number of sides. For example, if I created this in a hurry and I forgot to make sure that, for instance, maybe I only wanted 5 sides for some really weird reason, I could totally do that. How many height segments I want, whether or not I want it to be smooth, or show the tessellation. Uh, and so we can do these with any number of the various primitives here, but the ones that I usually are, oh, these are actually kind of cool. There's house primitives. I just want to demo these real quick because I think they're actually quite funny. Oh, hose. I'm sorry. I was thinking of the LX and CX. These are really good for making houses. These are good for making like uh, collapsible accordion style hoses. They're pretty cool. So let's go ahead and go to standard primitives. One thing I want to talk about real quick is if you would like to adjust your defaults, you can go to customize. Unit setup is where you change your units. Here you have a choice between metric, and you've got millimeters, centimeters, meters, and kilometers. You can use US standard, custom, which is whatever weird thing you want to set up, and then generic units. And generic units are just one unit is one unit, and they don't really have any kind of real world allegory as far as I know. Lighting units I always leave set to international. I don't do a lot of rendering, so if you do, perhaps you want to change that. I don't, so I never really change it. Uh, and the other thing is you can come in and change a lot of your preferences. And one thing I really like about Max is Max already autosaves. I believe it's set to autosave every 5 minutes, but you can actually set it to increment on save so that you can work non-destructively and get a number of increments of a file in between saves, so you don't have to go back and undo like 500 times. You can adjust all of your settings here. The things that you're probably going to pay attention to the most are under general and files if you're just a modeler. So let's go ahead and get started on some of the actual tools here. I'm going to create a box. Most of my modeling starts with boxes. I'm just weird like that. Apparently I like to make my life harder than it needs to be. I'm just going to drag it on the grid. Max's creation works a lot like interactive creation in Maya. You can do things just by entering numbers here. Like if I delete this box and I click here, I can say I want like a 10 by 10 by 10 box with 1, 1, and 1, and then nope, I actually have to do that all after the fact. Okay, so you can plug all those numbers in, and here you can add more initial starting geometry. Like for example, if I decide I need a second subdivision in width and a second one in height or length, I can add those here. If I want to see those, I actually need to click on where it says realistic here and go to edged faces. Whenever it's using the realistic, it's going to render things without edges, or not visible edges anyway. So if you'd like to see your geometry, you're going to want to turn that on. So now that I have this, in order to be able to do anything with it, I actually need to convert this into geometry I can use. Because if I go over here, the only things I can do are adjust the parameters it already has. So in order to turn this into a polygonal object, I right click on this and I go down to convert to and convert to editable poly. And now it's a polygon, and now it has vertices and edges and faces and things that I can interact with. I could have changed this to a NURB surface or a number of other things, but generally you're probably going to be working in polygons. So here's a few other places where this is going to differ from Maya. One, the spacebar. The spacebar actually locks an object. So if you're coming from Maya and you're trying to use the spacebar's the hotbar, you're going to wind up locking your object. So if you do that and all of a sudden you can't scale it or rotate it or anything else, look for this little yellow lock down here. So I'm going to unlock that. Second off is to actually be able to select any of your geometry. Max uses a slightly different system than Maya does. So Max doesn't have an object mode. It's got top level, which is here. And you can select what you want from the list here. Like for example, if you want to work with vertices or edges or border edges, which, let's see if I can get that to work. Nope. But if I switch to edge, I can select as many edges as I want and work with those. Do something really silly like this. I can switch to vertices. I can move those around. Grab this guy in the middle and pull him up just for fun. maybe push this one back down, because if we're going to make a stupid shape, we might as well make a really stupid shape. There we go. um, okay, so now if you want to get back to your top level, for example, if I, let's call this poo box. So if I create another object, let's create a teapot. So fun fact, teapot is a max primitive because the very first ever 3D model was a teapot, in case you're curious. It was actually done mathematically by hand. A guy plotted out the position of the vertices on graph paper and then programmed them into a computer to render the first ever 3D object, which was a teapot that he had on hand. So I'm going to switch this to an editable poly. And so if I'm over here working in vertice mode on this thing and making adjustments to various things, or just doing whatever it is that I'm doing, I can't just select the teapot now. Nothing I do, in fact, will allow me to select the teapot. In order to do that, I just simply need to either uncheck the mode that I'm working in, which returns me to top level, or if I right click, I can select top level from the menu that's there, which will allow me to select any other object in the scene at that point. Once you're on top level, you can select any number of objects at their topmost level. However, if I want to work on in vertice mode on this and in this, I can't do that when they're two separate objects. I would have to combine them, which I can actually do through the attach menu here. If I hit attach and then select this, notice they're the same color now. If I undo attach, they are now attached, so they share a single pivot now. Anything that I select, so if I come into verts, now these are verts as well, and I could do things like weld these verts to these verts. If I grab like target weld here, actually. Oh, and then once we have these connected, if I need to move this, for example, if this is too far away and I need to move it closer to this, I can go over here to element, and element will allow me to select any individual element of my mesh. Like, for example, this lid is a separate piece from this body, which is a separate piece from the spout, which is a separate piece from the handle. So using element will allow me to select any or all of those. So most of the tools that you're going to use are a little bit different than the tools that you're probably used to using in Maya. I'm going to get rid of these. Going to make a new box. This time I'm just going to make a box. If I right click on these spinners on the bottom arrows, I can basically drop these down to their lowest values. And that works on all the spinner boxes here. I can do this to all of these. We can make a non-existent cube 0 by 0 by 0. Let's go back to, let's see, let's go 30 in length by 45 in width by 186 in height. In case you're curious, those are about the dimensions of a person. They might be a little bit thicker than that, actually. They might be, they're probably actually closer to 45 centimeters thick and probably like 60 wide. I don't know, that seems pretty wide. But yeah, this is about human size. So if you're going to create anything for a game engine, which is what most of my work in a program like this is, I tend to set up these dimensions first to give a scale of what human size is. So as I'm creating things, I don't just start working at imaginary scale, which is a problem. And if you've done this kind of work before, you may have ran into that. So I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to convert this to an editable poly. I'm going to move this out of the way. And now I am going to create another box. And this time I'm going to eyeball a lot of this. I'm going to make something that's roughly wall height. So see, walls, single story is usually about 10 feet. 10 feet is roughly what, 3.3 meters, I think. So that's going to be about 330 centimeters. Let's make this 200 centimeters wide, and let's give this an overall thickness of, let's see, a foot is roughly 20. Well, that's okay. Yeah, that's about right. So it's about a foot thick right now. I think it might be a little bit off. My math might be bad. So now I'm going to turn this into an editable poly. So for instance, if I want to make this a doorway, there's a number of different ways I could go about doing this. In Maya, you would probably just use the insert edge loop tool. Once we've converted these to editable polys, our modeling selection up here changes a little bit, and we have a lot more options. So what most of you generally know as insert edge loop in Maya is called Swift Loop in Max. And Max actually has some really useful tooltips for things as well. If you hover your mouse over any of them, like here you can see the tooltips for Swift Loop. So I can click on this and then I get a live preview of wherever I want my loop. So let's sort of make a little bit of a doorway here. So I'm going to click, and right about there. If I'm being really anal retentive, I would actually only model half of this and then I would just mirror it. Trying to model both halves of things there's really no need unless you need those two halves to be non-symmetrical or unique in some manner. Otherwise, like modeling one half of something is perfectly acceptable. So now that I've got the basic frame of where the door would be, I can switch to polygon mode, which is the thing here that looks like a square. And I'm going to grab this doorway here. The extrude tool in Max doesn't work the same way the extrude tool in Maya does. The extrude tool in Maya combines several actions in one tool, makes it really useful. The allegory for that in Max is actually the bevel tool. The bevel tool, if you click the little options box, you can see we can extrude geometry here, but we can also do an outline similar to the extrude tool in Maya. So I'm actually going to close this because I don't want to use that. In this case, I do want to use the extrude tool. And the extrude tool in Max can only push in or out. You can't offset those edges at all. If you want to do that, you need to use the bevel tool. However, there are a few things here that 3ds Max can do that Maya can't. For example, you have a choice on what you're extruding. So group is what Maya does, where it groups all the polygons together. Local normal is based on its local surface normal. So for instance, if I grab this side here and I hit extrude, you'll see that this one is going to push out based on its surface normal, as opposed to this one here, where if I switch this back to group, oh, never mind, there's no real effect there. I think I would have to muck this geometry up a little bit more for it to have a noticeable effect. Anyway, so I'm going to grab this. I am going to hit extrude. I'm going to pull this back in, and we're going to delete that face and hit OK. It didn't work exactly the way I wanted, but that's fine. It'll give me a chance to show how a few other things here work. So I tend to work like this a lot in Max. I carve up the geometry I need and then rebuild it as I need it. So here I'm going to bridge these edges. So if I just select them both and hit bridge, it'll automatically bridge them based on what its settings are. If I want to change those settings, I can click the little box next to it, and I have a number of settings here. Like I can change the number of edge loops that it puts in. I can change the bridge adjacent angle, whether or not it's smooth or has hard edges, and then whether it's using edge selection or a different kind of selection based on whatever I'm using. So I'm going to bridge all of these edges real quick. So most of you who've used Maya are used to the bevel tool doing something a little bit different than what it does here. You're used to it doing something along the lines of what the chamfer tool does. The chamfer tool adds a beveled edge to things. You'll notice here it works pretty much identical to Maya's bevel tool. I tend to not use this because of the triangular poles it creates. It's not a huge deal. I just don't like it. Migrating those out and cleaning that up can sometimes be a pain. Right here, it's created a five-sided poly that I don't necessarily need. And if I hit OK, and if I come in here and let's say I collapse these two verts here, oh, that actually looks quite a bit better than I thought it was going to. Sometimes it'll cause a little bit of a headache where it just won't look very nice. This honestly, in this case, is an unnecessary step because I could have done essentially the same thing by inserting an edge loop and then scaling in or out a little bit to get the same kind of effect. But it's okay. We got a nice little bevel on that edge. So depending on how complex your geometry is, this might be a really quick way to get this done. And if you're doing game models and it's going to be triangulated anyway, it's probably not a big deal. Just generally, if you're going to smooth, for example, if you're doing this as a high poly model for your normal matte bake or your AO bake, you're not going to want to leave a lot of tries in there. They don't smooth very well. They're fairly noticeable. They tend to look kind of poopy when you smooth them. So just don't do that. So let's say that this was going to be a stationary asset. The door on it was going to be decorative. I don't actually need it to open. I just need it to look like a door. It just needs to block the player's progress. And for whatever reason, our 3D budget won't allow for a special door to get made. Um, it seems like a really silly hypothetical scenario, but perhaps it's not that silly. Maybe it does actually happen that way sometimes. So I can grab this edge. I'm going to extrude it out. If you just hit the extrude button, it sort of lets you freeform do it. I don't particularly like to do this. I feel like there's a little too much guesswork involved, but I don't know. It's not really that bad. I'm gonna, at least for this. I mean, this what we're doing here is incredibly simple, so it doesn't need any real complex operations done on the geometry. Let's come up here. Let's grab our verts, and I'm going to use target weld to weld this guy to this guy, and we're going to weld this one to this one. And then we're going to come down at the bottom and do the same thing, just to help close this off. And I'm probably going to delete all these bottom faces because they're bottom faces and we don't need them. And that one right there is a six-sided face, which we definitely don't need. In theory, we probably also don't need both sides of this. I don't know why I gave it any thickness. Um, I could have just extruded out a single edge and created the same face that way, or bridged between two edges and done the same thing. But let's do a little bit more work on this work that is probably entirely unnecessary. But I want to make this geometry a little bit more complex, and then kind of the point of doing this stream was to show the UV unwrapping tools. Actually, while we're at it, there's some other cool tools I want to show that Maya doesn't have that I really love about Max. So one of the things about Max is the cut tool in Max doesn't need an edge to start. It doesn't need a vert to start. I can, if I wanted to do something incredibly awful and fairly dumb like this, I totally can. And now I've got this weird poly in the middle of this other poly for no discernible reason. Um, Side note, if you want to delete components in your mesh, like if you want to delete vertices or edges, don't hit delete. If you do, it will generally create a hole there. Select the things you want to delete and hold control and hit backspace, and notice that it deleted all those things. So I don't like to use the cut tool because the cut tool can cut directly into faces, and there was an old bug in Max that if you had unmerged verts on a face and you tried to relax that face while you were UV unwrapping, it would crash. Just everything would crash. No warning, no notice, no autosave, nothing. Just straight back to your desktop. And also, when I was working on Forza Horizon 2, there was a similar issue where the cut tool was causing Max to crash, and we were on a really tight deadline, and that was a nightmare. So what you can do instead is, if you need to connect some verts, you can select the verts you need to, or that you are hoping to connect, and there is actually, under loops, you can just hit connect, and there's also a distance connect. um, you can insert a loop, but what's really cool is if I select a couple of edges, like for instance, if I have some weird geometry that won't allow me to use insert edge loop or swift loop, which will happen if you've done ge- complex operations on the geometry. For instance, if you've done a lot of extrudes and the edge flow doesn't go straight across an object anymore, but you still need an edge loop to go straight across an object, you could try and cut it. However, it isn't always going to work, and for anyone that's used Maya's cut tool, sometimes it just decides that it can't cut across a surface for some reason. So what you can do instead is I come over here to edges, and right here we've got insert vertices, and I can insert any number of vertices in these edges. But for now, I'm just going to insert one, and it's always going to insert them in the middle. And they're not connected, but thankfully they're all selected. So now I can just go over here to loops and hit connect. And now I have an edge loop through there that connects all of those. And here, this might not seem like the most important thing, but this is really, really handy when you're doing organic modeling, and you need to connect some you need to connect things that aren't actually connected to one another. Just be careful, because something like this, you might think that you're going to connect across like this, but what's actually going to happen is usually it's going to try and connect each of those vertices to every other one. Here it actually did exactly what I wanted it to, which rarely happens. Okay, so let me play with this a little bit more real quick, and then we're just going to do some weird things to it and then unwrap it. So I'm going to bevel, and let's go ahead and push this out a little bit. Now I'm going to grab these faces here, and we're going to do the same thing, but instead of on group, we're going to do by poly to get that effect there. Let's see, for fun, let's add some trim elements around the bottom of this. One thing I will say that it looks like well, let's just go ahead and take care of that. I didn't realize that I had welded these together on the backside, so let's just go ahead and get rid of this as well. This is sort of like I was saying, we could have done a lot of this without adding extra geometry, so since I already started reducing it on accident, let's just go ahead and finish that off. If you're trying to target weld something to something else and it won't, and it won't weld either if you're hitting merge and nothing's happening, or weld, I guess. Um, Chances are that that vert is floating in the middle of a face, and I'll show you what I mean in just a second. Let me do this. Let's grab that cut tool. I'm going to cut from here down to here just to do it. And now I'm going to delete this because I don't want it. Oh, I got rid of everything. Okay, instead, why don't we merge this over? Now I'm going to grab these edges. I'm going to grab one of these edges and see if it'll let me delete only one. It probably took them both. All right. Well, anyway, sometimes when you're cutting, you'll get, if you're using the cut tool, you'll run into something where you're trying to cut directly on edges, but you've missed a little bit, even if it looks like you've nailed it. And so in that instance, and I don't know if that's happened here at all. In that instance, sometimes what's going to happen is you will go to try and weld verts together, and it will not allow you to. In this case, the geometry is still simple enough that Max isn't seeing anything wrong, so it's letting me merge everything together. Um, I've had this happen on models I was doing that were much more complex in their geometry, where a cut was just a little bit off, and it wouldn't let me do anything to that. And in the event that that happens, switch to polygon mode and select the face affected. And if the face looks like this, then everything's okay, and you got nothing to worry about. But sometimes you're going to get like a Hall of Mirrors effect. See if I can replicate that. Nope. Um, if that happens, just delete the face and rebuild that part. If it's a really complex face that you can't rebuild for some reason, you can try and collapse some verts together. You can try and delete some edges and see if it'll let you rebuild them. But generally, in most cases, I find that at that point, it's much better just to delete that face and rebuild it. Usually, there's enough supporting geometry around that you should be able to build that up pretty quickly. Okay, so let's get back to what I was doing before I got sidetracked. This used to happen in my classes a lot. I would go off on tangents and then quickly forget what I was talking about, which is kind of funny. Oh, speaking of tangents, quick side note. Quick slice, this is the same thing as Maya's razor blade of death. It does the same thing, cuts through an object without regard to geometry or edge loops. I wouldn't use it, but I'll leave that up to you. I'm going to come down here, grab that, and uh, one thing that I really don't like about Max is that if you click on something, you can immediately move, rotate, or scale it if you have that tool selected. Hit the Q key. Q is just your general selection tool, and so you can't accidentally move something while you've got it. Another note is if you're selecting multiple components, you've got a number of different ways that you can select those. If you double click an edge, sometimes it will go all the way around if that edge only flows in one way, or if those faces only flow in one way. The rest of the time, you can do the standard hold Control and select more faces, and holding Alt will deselect them. However, if you need to select like an entire row or ring, for instance, these faces, if I need to select all the outside edges, I select one of them, and if I hold Shift, it will select all the other faces in that particular loop. However, it won't always work. For instance, if I select this and select this, of course now it's going to work and make me a liar. And that one worked too. All right, well, when your geometry gets more complex, that will start to become more of an issue. I wonder if this will work. Yep. Wow. Cool. Um, so, oh, in addition to that, and that works with everything too. That'll work with edges. For instance, I can grab this one and I can hold Shift and get this one, and notice it selected that whole ring of them. It works with verts. There's also uh, selection tools over here that will let you in your little sidebar here. And this, you just hold down the left mouse button in empty space on it. And when you see the little hand icon, that means you can move it about. So here I can grow my selection, which is just going to sort of grow it centrally based on where I had initially selected. But I can also do a loop, which will get everything. So it went up until this point where now this is no longer one single loop, but breaks off into three other ones. I can also grab a ring, which will grab everything all the way around. Okay, so back to what I was doing. Let's make this. Let's grab. Sure, we'll grab all this stuff on the backside too. Just want to have something slightly more complex for the unwrapping portion of the stream. So I'm going to grab these, and let's hit bevel. Maybe let's just do it by group. Ooh, that might not work. This is one of the problems with trying to do any operations by group is sometimes you run into stuff like this where um, because I've selected faces on both sides, when I give it an integer here or a number here, let's make this 10 centimeters. It needs to push them in one way if I have got by group selected. However, if I've got by local normal selected, it will push them out based on the local normal there. Sort of like what I demoed earlier. Very similar thing. So let's have it push that out by like 4 centimeters seems reasonable. And then I do want a little bit of a bevel to this, but I think I'm going to do it. Oop, crap. There we go. I'm going to hit OK. And I think what I'm going to do here is actually instead of using the bevel tool to kind of make make bits like this and then positioning them, I think I'm actually going to do something that makes a little bit more sense here. So one of the other ways to select a loop, this works with edges and verts and sometimes with polys, is if you double click the edge you're selecting, it will attempt to select the entire loop. And in this case, it actually selected everything I needed. So I'm going to take this. I'm actually going to drop it a little bit. A lot of this I'm doing here is just because it makes me happier. If you look at like your baseboards and stuff, none of them are at a 90-degree angle. And if you're doing a high poly for normal matte bake, and if you're doing that in Maya, I feel sorry for you. You really should do it in Max. And I might be able to show why, not today, but soon. Uh, you're going to want non 90-degree edges. Normal matte baking doesn't pick up 90-degree edges very well, and so having these a little bit off like that will be really nice. And plus, visually, it just makes more sense and it looks a little bit better. I'm going to take this a step further though, and I'm going to chamfer that edge. I want just a little bit more breakup in there of that surface. Did not mean to do that. Let's spread that a little bit more. I could add more edges, but I really don't need to. Maybe one more? Nah. Let's go back down to one. I'm just going to hit OK. I'm going to have to fix some of this geometry. Like, for instance, we've got, what's that, a six-sided face now? But that'll be pretty easy to fix. I could come in and actually probably one of the easiest ways to do this would just be to select that edge, and if I throw a vert in there, haha, and I select these two verts, and then I'll go to loops and I will connect them, and now I've got two quads again. That was actually quite easy. Now we'll go do this on the other side just because I like that. In theory, if this is just your game engine model, it doesn't matter. Game engines generally do auto triangulate when you bring an object in, unless you're setting it to rotated quads. But you want, in most cases, you're going to want control over your triangle edges and where they are. And for all you know, it might take all of these and split all of these edges down to this vert down here, and maybe that looks weird. Maybe it creates a weird pull in your texture, or maybe it causes some issues with the way the surface looks. So, I like to be a little anal retentive about where things go, and I find that this serves me fairly well. So I'm going to grab that edge there, and I'm going to insert a new vertice there. Now let's grab this vert and connect them. And there we go. All quads and everything's happy. If this was going to Honestly, if this was going to be a game model, I might adjust that geometry a little bit. This interrupts a lot of edge flow. Now, actually, I bet let's go to edit in Swift Loop. I want to see something. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. Uh, so you can see here, like what I've done is screwed up the edge flow a little bit here. It's not too bad. Um, but it was really hard to hit that edge that I was aiming for, and it really, really didn't want to do it. It's still working all right though. Ooh, just get rid of that because I don't need it, and it's mostly just in the way. So if this is the object that I was going to UV unwrap, one of the reasons I like Max, like I said earlier, is because of its UV unwrap tools. They're really pretty fantastically good. If you've used Roadkill or Hedis UV layout, you've essentially got the idea. It works in a very similar manner. So I should talk about a few things over here first before we get started on anything else. So in addition to our creation tab here, we've got our modify tab, which is where we're going to do most of our work. And there's a lot of things here that I've either glossed over or haven't even like really talked about. One incredibly important one is let's grab some edges or faces. It'll work with either one. We can just grab everything. Max uses a different thing than Maya's hard and soft edges. Max has a thing called smoothing groups, and most game engines recognize smoothing groups. So here you can see that these have all been taken. So these are individual smoothing groups. And I can actually clear all of these. And if I wanted to, if I clear them, it makes perfectly hard edges everywhere. If I want any of these edges to be soft or any of these faces to be soft, for example, if I wanted, for whatever reason, the very bottom of this door bit to be soft, grab all the parts we want, have that happen to, and I can hit auto smooth. And what we'll see is if I turn off edged faces, oops. If I turn off edge faces, you can see it's softened the normal angles in between them. Those are still hard edges essentially, like they're not rounded, they're just soft. They've just softened the normals. And that becomes much more apparent when I select those faces, but when we look at it, they look a little bit more round and soft. I could do that to everything on the object. Let's hit auto smooth and we get this weird lumpy pillow. That looks incredibly gross. Generally, for games, you're going to want some of that smoothness. It's going to help your normal maps read better. And when you want to assign things in Max to specific smoothing groups, for instance, if you've got an object and you're plotting the parts out and you need smoothing group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. to be things that you've picked and you know what they are, that's as easy as selecting the parts that you want in that smoothing group and hitting that button. So this is now part of smoothing group 1. And I can do something really weird too, like maybe I want only these parts to be on smoothing group 2. Now those are on smoothing group 2, although right now they're not going to really do much because they don't have another edge to smooth between. So let's actually change. Now we'll hit 2, and now we should see a bit more of an effect. And I can do the same. I can do something similar here. For instance, I could assign these to smoothing group 3 if I wanted to for any reason, and here it's getting a little confused as to what's going on because it can't smooth. It hasn't smooth. It's smoothing from this to this, and this to this, and this to this, and this to this, but not from this to this, which is why we're getting these edges here. These edges here that are blending into the softer part up top. Anyway, I'm going to hit clear all. I'm just going to select everything and clear all. And now we need to talk about a few other things up here. So the next tab over, if you want to adjust your pivot, or as you're working, sometimes your pivot is going to get off center. For instance, if I oops, let's select my box here or my doorway, and I'm going to edit swift loop, and let's throw a loop down the middle. Then let's grab one whole side of this and delete it, and go back to top level. So now notice my pivot's still where it was originally. Excuse me. And that might not be where I want it when I'm working. So if I need to adjust that pivot at all, click this next tab over. And here I can affect a number of different things, but generally I use this to recenter the pivot. So select Affect Pivot Only and then Center to Object, and it will center that to the object. You can also align it to the object if your object is on a weird local axis. Grab this. We can go back over here, and we can go Affect Pivot Only and Align to Object. Of course, it didn't do anything that time. Oh, center to object, align to object. And you can also align it to the world if it gets weird. And barring anything else, you can reset it back to its original position. There we go. So let's. So right now it's aligned to the world. Notice how it's still paying attention to the world space coordinates. If I align that to the object, nuts. Center it to object, it's still going to be on world space coordinates. So let's undo my rotation here. There we go. So yeah, if you need to move your pivot, if you need to adjust it, that's the way to do it. You can also affect the object only, so you can center that to the pivot or align to the pivot or the world. And then you can also edit your working pivot and where it is. And so this is going to affect where your object rotates around, where the camera will actually rotate around when you have that object selected as well. So these are just some things to keep in mind. And then the next one that is going to be important for 3D artists to know is over here in Utilities. We've got Reset X Form. So selecting an object and then selecting Reset Selected will, this is the same as freezing transforms and deleting the history in Maya. So if I need to uncheck Edit Working Pivot, there we go. So I'm going to come back over here, Reset X Form Selected, I'm going to hit Reset Selected. So now if I go back to my Modify panel, I've got this X form that's around this. And so this here is called the modifier stack, and this is sort of like Max's history. Any modifiers I add, and there are a lot. For instance, I can add this to it, the chamfer modifier, and it automatically chamfered all my edges. If I don't want that, I can right click on it and delete, or I can select it in here and delete it. Some of these have pluses, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because one of the things I need to do is mirror this, since I cut it in half. So I'm okay with the X forms getting resetted. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to right click over here and I'm going to collapse all. Um, and collapsing all is kind of important. Some people like to work with a big modifier stack. I don't, because some things above the modifier in the modifier stack above are going to get broken if you change something like in the editable poly itself. So as I finish any particular operation, I like to drop that stack down. If I'm worried about it, I'll do an iterative save before I do that. That'll leave that modifier there just in case something goes horribly wrong. Um, but let's talk about something. We'll use the mirror modifier because that's something a lot of you are going to have to use quite often. This doesn't work the same way that Maya's does, and it takes a little finessing. So you'll notice that there's mirror and mirror center, and what you actually want to be moving is usually the mirror. Oh, god damn it. I don't want to offset that. Am I mirroring on? No, I'm mirroring on the right axis. It's the x-axis I want to mirror on. Oh, I always forget this. You got to hit copy. If you don't hit copy, it won't do anything. And then you can just pull on the mirror center to drag the rest of your thingy out. Um, so we can go back to our oh, this is the other thing, is because I have this mirrored, I can't really do anything to the geometry until I collapse this. I know the mirror is there, but right now I'm going to have unmerged vertices and other things, and honestly, there's only half of this until I collapse the stack. So I'm going to hit collapse all. Sort of like merging layers in Photoshop. It's a very similar idea. So now there's something I need to be sure of. Notice that it left me all these verts here. It didn't connect them. Uh, in fact, I think I could. Those might actually be overlapping. Let's switch to my front view. Or actually, this one will work. And grab everything from here over. Where is it? These guys. Aha, there we go. That's what I thought. So if you see that, notice they just overlap them, but these are not merged together, and these are still technically two separate objects. I mean, they're one object, but they're not merged into one. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to grab all of these. Let's hit weld. In fact, let's. I want to change some viewport stuff here so I can actually see um, the poly count. And to do that, you hit the little plus here, and you come to configure viewports, and that's under statistics, this tab here. We can get our poly count, and I like total plus selection. I like my vertex count also, and triangle count's better than poly count. And let's show statistics in average view, or active view, average view. Okay. So I can't really tell if that did anything, so I can grab just one vert and move it. And okay, those vertices didn't weld themselves together, so let's grab them all and go here. So according to this, I've got 38 verts selected. Hit weld, I still have 38. So let's hit the little options box. Right now it's trying to weld everything within a tenth of a centimeter, and those are right on top of each other. It should be welding, but it's not. So let's just crank this number up. Oh, except for now what we're getting is it's welding all of these. There we go. Before 132, after 128. Let's hit OK. Um, perhaps, actually, I'm curious about something. I'm going to just delete all of those. One, I don't need them. They're just in the way. Alright, that's what I thought. So we've got some messy geometry in here we need to clean up. First things first, I'm going to see if it'll let me connect these. It probably won't because we have a bit of a mess. So this might take a little bit of work to clean up. I was hoping something like this might happen. Okay, so it's not letting me weld these. I'm not really sure why. So we're going to try to target weld and see if I can weld one vert to another. Okay, that works. So our regular weld isn't working. Um, Not a super huge deal. Let's just hit weld and see what happens. Okay, that didn't work. But if we crank in, alright, so if we crank this up, there we go. Um, Now I wonder if I can select all of them and have them merge without accidentally merging things I don't want to. This was something that used to happen to me often in Maya. If I wasn't paying attention, I would select something and I'd be looking at the front instead of the back, or specifically if I needed to look at the front. Sweet. Okay, that looks like it did a pretty good job. And anyway, like, so sometimes I'd wind up merging things together that didn't need to be. So let's see. Okay, now I can delete those. Beautiful. So now I've got this surface here. It's, oh wait, nope, it did not like that one freaking bit. And there's no, those aren't doing anything. It doesn't need those there. I don't know why it's breaking all of that. Okay, let's try and connect them all now. Here, let's go Command or Alt W. Let's grab all these guys in the middle. And let's go loops, connect. Okay, let's do loops, distance connect. Okay, cool. I like a good problem. Okay, for whatever reason, it's not wanting to do that, so let's select those and deselect you. And see if we can do it on... Oh, I see part of the problem. Part of what happened here is I welded together things I may not have wanted to. Let's just grab element and get it out of the way. Oh, hey, look at that. Some of them merged, but some didn't. That's really, really funny. Okay, let's look at those verts again, because it was showing there being something up in here. Okay, that's being decidedly difficult for no particularly good reason. I'm going to back up a few steps here. Okay, I see what's going on there. So in this case, I might actually just have to come through here, and for something like this, I'm actually just going to use collapse to make sure that it just averages the distance between the two verts. And it just helps keep everything nice and in line and straight. And depending on what you're doing, that might be really important. In the case of what I'm doing here, it's probably not terribly important, but just because I'm screwing around doesn't mean that I shouldn't use best practices for screwing around. If there isn't best practices for screwing around, there really should be. How to screw around to greatest effect. And also, if you're doing this, be careful. Make sure you've got your heads-up display turned on here, so you can make sure that you're only selecting things you want. Reason being that it's really easy to select things on the other side of the model sometimes and not know it. And if you're using collapse, you'll wind up collapsing the front of the model to the back of the model. And you just really don't want to do that. What the hell just happened there? As the thing I was talking about, it said I had 4 selected, so it was collapsing these two things together, which is entirely unnecessary. And there we go, 2, so we can collapse those. Now I can collapse those, and let's actually get rid of this. I wasn't paying attention. I didn't realize that was there. We don't need it. The player's never going to see it. And right now it's just triangles taking up space. Delete that. Perfect. Okay, so let's go back to verts and finish cleaning this thing up, and I'll get it to a point where it can be unwrapped, and we'll talk about Max's unwrapping tools. Grab those guys, and let's collapse those. And grab those guys, and let's do the same thing. So I still only have 2 selected. I want to change the color of this. This mesh is driving me insane. This is another thing I like about Max is it automatically assigns a color to something when you create it, and at any point you can change those colors. I like darker colors because it makes it easier to see edges when you have edge faces on. Let's see, and also it makes it easier to read your heads-up display. So collapse. Let's grab those and collapse. Okay, I think let's just double check. If this was a game model, I would do a lot of cleanup on this. There's a lot of really unnecessary tries, like most of the shit in the back could get collapsed out. Hell, while I'm here being anal retentive, let's go all the way. So I'm going to clean up this geometry a little bit because it really is making me a little crazy seeing it, and I don't like teaching the wrong way to do things. So generally with game models, you're going to want to you're going to want to reduce as many triangles out of it as possible. Like these triangles here aren't doing anything. They're each one of these quads is 4 triangles, and like really if your triangles aren't doing anything, there's no reason to have them there. If they're necessary for the silhouette, like go for it. That's great. But you know, if there's something like this is yeah, that'll be okay. Um, you know, just kind of collapsing them out and getting rid of them. Like, you know, granted that was what 4, 8, 12, 16, 16 tries I just collapsed out. Not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but you know, when you imagine that on a much larger scale model, and I could even take this further. For instance, I could probably take these guys here and do something like this, or better yet, because we said that that door was never going to open, what I could actually do and what I should do, and if you're familiar with Unreal and you've seen assets in that, you've seen this, is we're just going to delete the entire back face of this, because if no one's going to see it, there is absolutely no reason for it to be there. So I'm going to select all of that and then deselect all of that. Okay, so let's delete that. And I'm gonna keep the sides. I like having some thickness. It makes meshes like this a little bit more versatile, but this gives me a good thing to work with for UV unwrapping. And so I do want to get rid of that edge in the middle. That was kind of half the point of all of that work I just did. And there we go. No more edge in the middle. Our thing's one piece. It looks nice. I mean, as nice as a test piece can look. So let's unwrap this thing. Um, First things first, I'm going to get back to my top level. Um, Oh, and for those playing the home game, this over here is your outliner in Maya. It's just built directly into the interface now. It's kind of nice. It was a little disconcerting at first because I missed having all that bonus screen space, but that's okay. Unhide that. You can hide, that's what the little light bulbs are. You can hide things that way. You can also freeze them by clicking the little snowflake, and now I can do nothing to this. I can't select it, which is great if you're building complex objects. You can freeze parts that you aren't working on in order to focus on the part you are working on, especially if you can't just hide everything around it and you need it there because what you're building connects to it or has some relationship and size to it that you need to be aware of while you're building. So anyway, I've got this thing ready to go. So just to be safe, I did some stuff on it. So we're going to go back over here and we're going to reset X forms. Select this guy, reset selected. While we're at it, I'm going to center my pivot to the object. And I'm going to come back over here. We're going to collapse the stack. And now we're ready to go. So if I just throw a UVW unwrap modifier on here, so this is modifier stack is where you're going to find things like that. It's also where you're going to find a lot of the deformers that you would have in Maya, things like the ripple or uh, wave and a number of other deformers. Um, Also, this is where you'll find things like turbo smooth, which is what you actually use to smooth. Throwing a smooth modifier on there is not the same as adding levels of smooth in Maya. It is just creating smoothing groups. It's an old modifier. I'm not sure why it's still there. All of that's just kind of built directly into the interface now. But down here is where you're going to find all of your UVW modifiers. So if we just throw a unwrap UVW modifier on here, if we look at this, we can see it's already made some cuts for us. And Maya does this too. If you've used Maya, you've seen this, and it's probably irritated the hell out of you because it might not always put those cuts in spots that you want them. Sometimes you get weird cuts in places, and maybe you don't want that cut in that particular spot because you want to keep the you don't want a seam there. And so you could finish unwrapping and then figure out where that cut was and weld those things back together and then re-relax them and get them repositioned. Or I find it's generally a whole lot easier to just clear all of the UVs right at the start. I come up here to the modifier list and we go UVW mapping clear. So I'm going to collapse this because I don't need that clear. It doesn't have any options. So now if I come back in and I go unwrap UVW, the only edges I have now, the only cuts that have been made for me are border edges. So the rest of the object now is ready to be cut up as much as I want. And so you can do most of this in your viewport if you want to, and sometimes it's advisable. This is your These are your selections here. You can select verts, edges, or polys. When I'm doing the initial cuts, edges are what you're going to use. Um, and unless your UV editor is open, selecting an edge and I use the hotkey, which is Control B for break. Usually won't work. Usually you need to have your UV editor open. And I'm going to drag this off screen for a minute, and we're just going to cut this thing up. So now I can come in and I can put cuts wherever I want them. So I can determine where the UVs for this thing go. where all the cuts are going to be, where my seams are going to be, and those are all really important things for you if you're a 3D artist. This is again why I love Max. Is this is a really really fantastic and really powerful tool right here. So Control B, and we can see that those are now cut. So let's look at this. This thin strip here, I don't want by itself. Thin strips they tend to not unwrap well, and it'll just look kind of poopy. So let's think about what I want this to be unwrapped with. Because of these shapes, I can't really include it with the rest of the geometry. I might be able to, but I would have seams in each of these four corners. Come to think of it, I'm going to have anyway. So for something like this, I'm actually going to try. I don't actually need a cut in all of those corners. I could have gotten away with just one. Okay, so I'm actually going to come around the edges of this thing, and let's get the outermost edge. And let's break those. I'm probably going to wind up welding one of these corners back together. I wasn't really thinking when I was doing this. I got a little gung-ho. It happens sometimes. And I put a cut in this corner and this one offset, which means now instead of one long piece, I have several separate pieces, which I might not want. I might want to keep that in one piece. I like to have as few seams as possible. It's not always possible, but sometimes. So let's come up here and I'm going to select you, and let's select you. We can break there. So these pieces in the middle, these are going to have to get cut out, and then I'm probably going to have to cut these also. And sometimes with edges, that's not so bad. I'm probably going to paint over those edges later to make them look worn. So here, this is fine, and this will still unwrap as one piece. It'll just have some cuts in it. So I'm gonna stop talking, and I'm just gonna really quickly come through and finish the unwrap job that I'm doing here. So some of knowing where to cut is just going to come with practice. And I mean, to be fair, I'm not even certain if these are actually where I want my cuts. I'm going to make them, and then I'm going to see once we've got all this done, and I might still wind up doing some sewing things back together. But for right now, I think this is okay. Yeah, based on the way that I've done this, I think I know how it's going to unroll, but we need to finish up this area down here. So, I think we're going to have to cut around this edge. Actually, we might be able to get away with just that. Usually these end cap type areas, you're going to have a seam somewhere, and I would pick the place that you think is going to be the least obvious. And here, I'm not really sure where that is, so we're just going to put the seam on these two edges here and leave it connected here, and we'll see how that looks when we come back. Alright, so I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. Now let's hit Control B and break those. Okay, so now it's time to see how big a mess I've made. UV unwrapping was never one of my strongest suits, but it's something that thankfully with practice I'm getting a lot better at. So here's our UV editor, and here's our object. A few things about making selections in here. I don't remember how Maya's worked. I used it once for one project when I was in school. It was utterly awful, and I never used it again. Maya's UV editor was garbage, and this was in like Maya 8.5. Maybe it's better now. I really don't know. Don't care either. So you'll notice down here we have the same selections that we had on our side panel over here for working within our UV editor. We also have this guy here. It appears over here is just not usually less important. And what this is if I have that selected, selecting anything will select the entire UV shell that's attached to it. In this case, I want to select all of my UV shells. And up here, I'm going to go to Tools, and I'm going to go to Relax. And we're going to relax these. It'll unfold them and lay them out. It'll attempt to. We'll see how good a job it does. So let's start with by poly angles, and we'll leave the default settings for now. I'm going to hit Start Relax. That actually did a halfway decent job. So we'll just let it finish working through that. It's going to straighten those edges out as much as it can. And if it doesn't, we have some great tools for doing that on our own. So it's not a really big deal if it doesn't. It's just a little bit more work. But thankfully, this is a very simple object. There's not a lot here. This is very easy for it to unwrap. So I can hit stop now. And let's come in and start grabbing some individual shells and moving them around. Get a better idea of what we wound up with here. Okay, cool. These parts worked more or less like I thought they were going to, and I might even be able to sew some of those edges back together. We'll see in a minute. These guys, actually, that flattened out maybe nice. Let's see. I'm not certain it did, actually. Oh, no, it did. This, on the other hand, let's see what that is. Aha. Okay. I was hoping something like this would happen. So when we get long, narrow strips like this, this is also because they're still connected at these corners. So one, I'm going to cut that corner real quick. I'm going to cut at least one of them. For now, I'm probably going to do a little work on that to get that put back together in a minute. So now I'm going to make sure I have this checked. I'm going to select the shell again, and let's bring up our relax box again. Let's grab them both. I want you to. Let's hit start relax. Okay, you'll see this sometimes, especially with long skinny things or like anything that isn't in a straight line. If you get that, switch to poly angles, give it its best try. Usually I'll try and switch back and forth between the two if I can't get something to work all right. This one actually turned out okay. Let's double check that. Let's see what that pertains to. Okay, cool. That's what I thought it was. And let's just double check. I want to make sure that there aren't any green. I wanted to make sure there's not any weird border edges inside, because that would mean it unfolded in on itself, sort of like this guy here did. So we have a few options for cleaning this thing up. It looks like a mess. It's not as bad as it looks. Thankfully, this is some fairly simple geometry if we can figure out where each of these bits is supposed to go. I'm not entirely certain, actually. So let's try something else first. I'm going to select this face. Okay, I was hoping that by moving some of those verts around it would... Okay, here we go. Okay, so this, thankfully, now is easy to fix. Let's grab those verts here. Let's move them over here. Hmm. Let's grab these. I wonder where exactly that is. Okay, I see what's going on here. This edge has been cut, but this one hasn't. So it's keeping them pinned together at this vert. Um, let's go ahead and finish that cut. I was trying to save myself some work and I actually just made my life more difficult, so that's alright. Now we should have two separate pieces here. Yay! Okay, so let's select both of these guys and let's hit start relax and boom. Now uh, they're both done. So I was hoping we might be able to sew these edges together, but because of the way that these relaxed, that's probably not going to work. We're going to have a weird angle there and they won't sew together nicely. We can try, like if I grab these guys, let's stitch the source. Um, oh, maybe. You never know. Holy shit, that worked. Okay, cool. Well, it's not totally straight, but that's fine. It's not a huge deal. It might be if you're trying to paint these objects, and you're trying to paint something specific, like a stripe that's supposed to go evenly across a surface. Um, let's hit relax on both those guys at the same time so they become the same size. Let's move this guy. I know that this is the bottom of my doorway because of this edge loop right here. So I know that if I want to weld these two pieces together, I need to rotate this guy around just to make my life a little bit easier. Let's rotate you around. And now just move you guys closer together. I'm a little bit worried about this. These areas here might not look so great when all is done and said. Like just because you can weld two edges together doesn't always mean that you should. A lot of that's going to depend on our texturing and what things are supposed to look like. And in this case, we might wind up with something where there's some weird stretching there, but we're going to keep our fingers crossed that this is all going to work out fine. I'm going to grab that thing, and one more time we're going to relax. I just want to... Whoa, look at that. Okay, this is kind of what I was afraid of there. Let's go back to polyangles, and maybe it can get it. And if not, we have other ways of straightening it out. You have to be really careful when you do things like this, though. Too much straightening, like if things relax and they won't go straight, what that's telling you is that those faces, that is the most relaxed that they can be for you to put a texture across that surface without any stretching. So right now what this is saying to me is if I want this straight, I'm probably going to get some stretching, and I'm going to get that stretching where the bends are occurring. So right here and right here we'll likely get some stretching, but for a piece this small, it's probably not going to matter. So I'm going to, let's see, easiest way to do this would be, let's grab all of the bits that we want. And now I am going to align horizontally to pivot. And now I'm going to move those down so they're out of the way. And so now I'm going to do the same things to the ones above them. I'm going to grab this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and this one, and this one, and this one. And let's align those horizontally to pivot as well. And now just move them down. Oops. Let's undo that. I'm going to hold shift, constrain it to one axis. Okay, and now we can just drag select the rest of these guys and we'll make those horizontal as well. Oop, I did the same thing. And there we go. So that piece is dealt with, and the rest of this is mostly okay. I don't know. I think that some of these pieces could probably get welded together. I don't think these all need to be separate. All right, so those two pieces connect. What does this connect to? That's not going to connect to anything because that's from this interior part of this door. So hopefully you can see based on the way these flatten out why I had to cut those edges, especially if we want them to lay flat and get painted on. So I'm going to move some things around real quick just to make my life a little bit easier. Okay, so I know that this will connect to this side of it. I know that this is going to connect to this side. So let's select this edge and let's. These are the different ways we can stitch. I tend to usually either stitch the source or average or target. It doesn't really matter because I'm going to come back in now and I'm going to relax these again. In this case, how I do this doesn't matter. There are cases where it will matter, though, so be aware of that. So let's grab all of this now and go tools, relax, and let's go polyangles. Start, bam, nice. Okay, so we got some nice edges here. These things welded together really nicely. Um, and so now at this point, it would just be a matter of packing these and rendering out the UVW template. Um, I don't remember how that works in Maya. Like I said, I haven't done it in a long time. And frankly, I think doing UVs in Maya is not just a nightmare, but just an exercise in futility and awfulness. Um, but for the sake of argument, I'm just gonna really quickly let's pack UVs, normalize, rescale. All right, cool. Let's do. Well, that did a terrible job of packing, but I guess I should have expected that. Ideally, you would do this by hand, and you would arrange these in there as best as you can, and you would make them uh, fill up as much of the 0 to 1 space as possible. Right now I'm using, like, that's not even a quarter of the 0 to 1 space. This is a terrible, terrible pack. You would never want to pack this way, but we're doing this just for to render out a UV template. So now I can go to my tools, and down here I've got render UVW template. If I hit that, I get this render UVs menu here, and you can type in your width and height that you want. So I generally like to work at 2048 and then downsample to 1024. So let's make this 2048. Don't really need to worry about any of this stuff. And then I hit render and it gives me this. This by itself I can't really do anything with. However, I can hit save. I can save as any of these types. I almost always use Targa. Give it a file name. I'll just save this to desktop so it's easy to find, and we'll call this test UVs and save. And I save 24 bits per pixel. You probably don't need to, and it's probably really not a big deal. So now I save that. I can close this, and if I minimize the window, here we see our test UVs.targa. And if I open up Photoshop, I'll be able to bring those in and start using those to paint on. So it's just a minute, and let's go open. And boom, there's our UVs, and we can start painting. That is a really terrible, terrible job. So for those of you that are familiar with Maya, hopefully that makes Max a little less scary. If nothing else, I mean, I will sometimes model in Maya because Maya does have some really good modeling tools that I haven't found allegories for in Max. For example, I haven't found an allegory for snap to curve or snap to vertex or snap to grid. We have some snapping up here, but I can never really seem to get these to work the way that I really want them to. And these are much more similar to how snapping works in something like Unreal. where Maya snapping, things like being able to hold down C and snap a vertex to a curve is a really nice tool. Um, and so I have before modeled something in Maya, brought it into Max in order to unwrap it, and that's perfectly acceptable thing to do. It works fine. I also like to model in Max though. It's got some very good tools, and I recommend spending some time learning it. If you'd like a more focused and less rambling introduction to it, there's some very good courses for it on digital tutors, and you can find a lot of other content on YouTube by people who do this much more than I do. Anyway, that's all I got for this bonus stream. I hope you guys have a good day. And tomorrow I will probably start working on an Unreal Tournament level, and we'll just be streaming all day, likely with the sound off, just so most of you don't hear me just cursing and mumbling. But if you're watching, you can feel free to ask any questions you have, and I'll do my best to pay attention and answer them. Anyway, thank you for watching, and have a good day.